All right, guys, welcome into the Alabama pregame show brought to you by Medical Properties Trust. It is officially September 3rd. We've only been talking about this day for several months now, joined by Mike Rodak, the Alabama beat reporter for AL.com. I am Simone Eli, your host. Mike, I feel like, we say for so many months, September 3rd, it's finally here. What does it feel like to wake up and know that college football is officially back, officially, even though we have had some games last week and throughout this week?
Yeah, I was going to say, it feels like it already came back Thursday night with that backyard
Sure.
brawl between West Virginia and Pitt. And
Yep.
I mean, there's been some Big Ten games between, you had the game in Ireland last week, and now there's Indiana and Illinois. And it's nice to have like good games early, even conference games early, with some of these Big Ten teams. So it's almost a little bit of a letdown to be covering an Alabama-Utah State game where there's a 41-point spread, but that's just kind of part of college football and part of September and getting through that.
It certainly is going to be a long September in Tuscaloosa. Alabama will open the season today under the lights, 6:30 at Bryant-Denny Stadium as Utah State comes to town. Like you said, Mike, 40-some point favorite. Alabama is at home. First game vibes. We've talked, Nick Saban was pretty much his typical Nick Saban, like he's been every single year that he's been at Alabama. Well, this is what we expect. This is, what we need from the guys. What has been the kind of the mood throughout practice? I know you can't really attend, but in press conferences, Mike, leading up to this game.
Well, I think the most telling comment from Saban probably came a couple nights ago in his first radio show of the season when he said, "I like this team. I really do." Which is, I mean, that's strong words from him. And just seeing 4 seasons of covering them, I don't think he's said something like that going into a season that I can remember. I think he said that about the 2020 team, probably as the year went on. And I think he had a lot of good things to say about them, especially, after that year, in terms of maybe them being the most complete team that they've had, the best team that they've had. But to say this before a game is played is pretty interesting to hear from Nick Saban. I think he put it this way too. Like, it's not the most talented team, or maybe it's not the most talented team, but he likes the leadership qualities, the intangibles, how players are approaching. And that's something he even said to a lesser extent going back to the spring on how players were a little bit more focused and there's more leadership. And, obviously what's implied there is that last year, some of those things weren't present. And I think that was clear, at the Texas A&M game and how they treated that week, according to Saban. And, some of those games, Tennessee, LSU, Arkansas, there were some tighter games in there that they ended up pulling out. Auburn, obviously, they won the SEC championship and then lost at the end. So there's definitely a different vibe, I would say, from last year. And that's a better vibe. But obviously it still, needs to manifest itself on the field, and that's something that we'll have to see over time.
I think that Saban likes to see his team player led, and to some extent, he talks a lot about leadership core. Obviously, we're going to talk about some of those guys in Will Anderson defensively, and of course Bryce Young at quarterback, the reigning Heisman Trophy winner. Let's talk about Utah State briefly a little bit. Utah State already 1-0 on the season, and obviously got it done against UConn last week. Running back Calvin Tyler Jr. went for 161, carried the ball 33 times. I know we don't pay a ton of attention to the stats and what these teams have done, but it's helpful in your first game, if you're Alabama, that you have some sort of film to go off of. I mean, definitely advantage to the Tide in that case scenario. Not that this is going to be a super competitive game, but at least you have something to show your guys going into week 1.
Yeah, exactly. And that's one of the things that's tough about college football too these days, and something Saban's talked about with all the guys that are transferring and how much these rosters are turning over. When they do their scouting reports in the summer, it's like, we don't know how this team is going to look. We don't know what they're going to use. We don't know how they're going to use all these new players. Utah State doesn't have as many new players as, let's say, Ole Miss might in November, but it's still a bit of a guessing game. And so having that week last week where at least you saw something out of Utah State. Now, obviously, if you're Utah State, you're going to be holding a lot back against UConn that you don't want to show Alabama. So I'm sure there's going to be new stuff that they'll show this week. But they are a good team in the sense that, they won the Mountain West last year. They went 11-2. They have a second-year coach now, Blake Anderson, who did some really good things at Arkansas State. Was one of the better passing offenses in the country at Arkansas State, was one of the better passing offenses in the country last year at Utah State. And it's a system that Nick Saban's kind of compared to Tennessee, what Tennessee runs now with Hendon Hooker, where they really spread things out. wide splits is kind of how he's put it, a Baylor style of offense. And you know, it's you can get into the nitty gritty later, but Alabama's weakness, if you might call it that right now, is probably their cornerback position. So you do have to wonder if you have a passing team like Utah State and have a quarterback who's in his 7th year in Logan Bonner, who played 5 years at Arkansas State, and now he's in his 2nd year at Utah State. He's gotten a few waivers to keep playing in NCAA. But an experienced quarterback, a coach who's definitely passing minded and an offensive minded coach. And if there's any chance of Utah State doing anything in the air against an Alabama team that maybe is more vulnerable in the back end of their defense than it is in the front.
Yeah. So one thing about this Utah State team, you know, they come into Tuscaloosa, obviously the major underdog, but that doesn't make them any less competitive. You know, guys hit the field. They don't care who it is on the opposite side of the ball. They want to get it done. Two Power 5 wins for this team last year against Oregon State and Washington State. We did talk to Nick Saban in his weekly press conferences on Monday and Wednesday. Coach obviously always kind of gives his straight up answer on what he expects from the first game. Here's what he had to say from Wednesday's interview.
I think one of the big things about first games and playing a team like this team create a lot of negative plays. They do a really good job of stunning and pressuring. That's been kind of their forte. They were one of the leading teams in the country last year in tackles for loss and creating negative plays. So you got to be patient. And I think when you get a hat on the hat, you've got a really good chance to make plays against them, but that's always the challenge. And they've got good players. They play hard. They're physical. They're tough.
So one of the biggest things, Mike, is I think guys get excited that they're going to play someone other than themselves. I mean, the fall camp is always such a grind. You start off strong, you're excited, then you get a couple weeks in, it's like, okay, I'm ready for it to be September 3rd, and it's here.
Exactly, yeah. And so this is obviously a time when you sort of want to just get out there and play. And it is a question of how much we will see a Bryce Young and some of these offensive starters, the new guys that we can get into later. But you know, if it's a blowout, I would imagine we're going to see a lot of different guys in there throughout the game. So it's somewhat like a preseason game. As good as Utah State is compared to an FCS opponent, they're still several notches below what Alabama is.
Yeah.
So it's somewhat of a preseason game. It is getting them ready to play at Texas next week.
Sure.
But you know, as far as like the Utah State in what they do, what Saban was just talking about in terms of the pressure, I would be interested to see on an offensive to defensive standpoint how Alabama's offensive line does, because I think that's a lot of people were concerned with that group last year, and rightfully so. I think Nick Saban was not happy at all with that group. They brought in a new coach, Eric Wolford, and there's been some changes at left tackle with Tyler Steen coming in from Vandy, and they have Kendall Randolph starting at left guard now over Javion Cohen. New right tackle starter and J.C. Latham. So basically 3 new guys and a new coach. And Saban's been really happy with what he's seen, actually. He thinks that there's been a lot of new ideas that Wolford's brought, and the players seem to like him better than they did Doug Marrone. And there's just a better understanding of what they need to do. And we'll have to see, again, if that manifests itself on the field. But there does seem to be more optimism about the offensive line going into the season maybe than there is on the defensive side about that weak spot being the cornerbacks.
If you're just tuned in, you're watching the Alabama pregame show brought to you by Medical Properties Trust. Week 1 of the season is finally here. The Tide host Utah State at home. 6:30 kickoff at Bryant-Denny Stadium. The game will air on the SEC Network. Mike Rodak and Simone Eli talking the transfer situation. Mike, you said a moment ago, you never know what you're going to get with teams now because the transfer portal is just absolutely wide open. And we expect a lot of transfers to play a big role in the Tide on both sides of the ball this year. Let's talk a little bit about what the expectation is for these guys going in not only to week 1, but into this season.
Yes, Alabama was, even though they brought in guys like Jamison Williams and Henry To'o last year, which was the first year of the rules being relaxed, they still were very selective about who they brought in this offseason. I mean, there's teams that brought in 12, 15, 20 transfers. Alabama brought in 5. And you see 3 of those names right there, and those are the 3 guys who probably start right away. But you know, they're guys who I think Alabama they wanted because they felt like they had a need at those positions, that those guys would play right away, and those guys wanted to come to Alabama because they weren't getting the playing time or the exposure or whatever you want to call it at their previous schools. So that's what kind of makes it a fit. But they're not going to just go out and find every single transfer and try to throw them into their system and assimilate them into their system, because it's not always going to work. And I think that's also the lesson that maybe they're learning with Eli Ricks on defense, being one of those transfers from LSU, who just it's been obvious that has been a little bit slow to learn the system. Nick Saban said that himself throughout the spring and the summer, and it doesn't seem like he's going to be starting right away at corner, despite all the hype and expectations about him over the summer. If I had guessed that tonight we'll see Kool-Aid McKinstry and Terrion Arnold, the two sophomores, starting at corner,
Sure.
with Eli Ricks maybe rotating in at some point. So, that's sort of the more disappointing end of the transfer portal. But I think Jahmyr Gibbs is an example of the more exciting end of it, where I'd be shocked if he doesn't start tonight. I think they want to play him in a really big role at running back and out of the backfield, catching passes, being explosive. I think he can do a lot of things that they really haven't had at running back. I mean, they've had some great running backs, but they've been more the big bruising type, the Derrick Henrys and Mark Ingram types. And Gibbs is more of a Alvin Kamara type, who they've had for a year, but more of that pass catching back who can is a little bit shiftier and can make big plays in the passing game. So I think they really like Gibbs. I think Burton has been a consistent player for him. Steen will start at left tackle. And then the other transfer we haven't talked about is Tyler Harrell from Louisville, who's super fast, ran a 4.24 at Louisville a couple years ago. Didn't really play a whole lot there, but did have, I think, 6 touchdowns and 18 catches last year, averaged 30 yards a catch, some real big playability. But came in here, had a foot sprain in fall camp, wasn't quite 100% until a week or two ago, and doesn't seem like he'll start. But maybe they'll work him in here and there and try to get a deep ball down the field to him.
Yeah. Speaking of receivers, Bryce Young spoke to the media on Monday, the first day of press conferences for Alabama and for game prep. And talked about the compatibility he has with this wide receiver core. He feels very confident in that. Let's hear from Bryce really quick.
Yeah, I think first and foremost, just the amount of reps we've been able to get, just trying to get stuff on the field, having conversations about reps, watching film together, and then in the meeting room as well, us making sure we're on the same page, us talking about how we like things ran, how they like, certain balls thrown, stuff like that. So it's just been a lot of communication, a lot of reps over time, and then, now that we're getting to game planning, obviously it's a little bit more specific, and the more we communicate, the more we're on the same page.
I'm forever impressed by this guy. I know that we've heard from him for a couple of years now, media days, just throughout weekly press conferences, but just his savvy, his confidence, his ability to never be too high or too low. I mean, if I'm a head coach, if I'm Nick Saban, and this guy is my quarterback, I'm sleeping pretty well at night.
Yeah, I mean, I think he loves a guy like that, especially in front of the media, where he's very pre-programmed and sort of he knows what he's going to say. He's not going to deviate.
But with a little bit of personality sometimes too.
Yeah, he knows it here and there.
Where he was so monotonous sometimes, it was like to
say
something else. At least Bryce, it juices it up a little bit.
He's no Johnny Manziel.
True that.
But he shows it here and there. I mean, he's sort of a very quiet, focused guy, even behind the scenes. Like, I don't think he's any different than what we see in front of the camera. And I'm sure that Saban loves that. I think that's how Saban wants to be. I don't think he's always that way. I think he gets fired up a little bit from here and there. But I do think in terms of like what Bryce was saying about the receivers, that it was tough at the end of that game against Georgia at the end of the year, where you don't have Jamison Williams, you don't have John Mechie. He's throwing to Slade Bolden and then a bunch of younger guys, Ja'Cory Brooks, Ajay Hall, Trayshawn Holden, who there wasn't that chemistry. They weren't performing that well, to be honest. I mean, Ajay Hall had a drop, Jaleel Billingsley had some drops, and that passing game just really sputtered in the second half of that game, which corresponded also with Stetson Bennett kind of catching fire for Georgia and making some big plays for them, and that's essentially what lost them the game. So I think going into this year, you still have to wonder, like, without Mechie, without Williams, those guys are gone. How does Bryce respond, and how does Bryce because it's still going to be Trayshawn Holden is going to be starting now as a junior, according to the depth chart. You have Kobe Prentice starting as a freshman who's had a really good fall camp, and then Burton. So 3 guys who he really hasn't thrown to that many times before this summer, let's say. And how does that all work out? I think is still a storyline that, maybe is a little bit underrated, but I don't think you can just assume that Bryce is going to go into all these games and throw for 450 yards like he did last year.
Yeah. Speaking of numbers, Laura Goldman running the show for us behind the scenes has stats from Bryce Young a year ago, obviously his Heisman year. These numbers are just pretty incredible. And we're talking about more than 4,800 yards passing, 47 pass touchdowns. I mean, I know that this is just Utah State. It's only week 1, but when the expectations are this high, Mike, I mean, you're sitting pretty when you got a guy in Bryce Young who is healthy, who is confident, and it has that savvy coming into this preseason like he does.
Yeah, exactly. And this is obviously going to be his last year. I don't think anybody will be thinking that he's going to be staying for a senior year. So this is the year that, I'm sure in his mind he needs to win a national championship, which he did as a freshman. He wasn't a starter, so he does have a ring, but this would be the first ring that he has as the starter. And, he's already won the Heisman. I'm sure that he would love to win it again. I don't think he's going to say that, but I'm sure, being the first or the second two-time Heisman finalist, the first since 1975, would be a great accomplishment. I'm sure he'd love to do that. Now, would voters go along with that? I think there's always that once you already have it, I think voters tend to look to somebody else, and there's a novelty factor that might help a Will Anderson or might help somebody else in college football, CJ Stroud.
Yeah.
So that could hurt Bryce, but I think he's capable of winning it again. And that's just how he is. I mean, he's a very good player, and he's going to be top 5 pick in the draft next year.
Well, in terms of legacy, and Bama fans in the comments, this, Bama fans all throughout the country, legacy is built a lot around national championships. Heisman winner, that's great. It's a nice little tip, hat tip to what the program is all about. But if you win a national championship, that kind of puts your name in the history books there for Alabama. So Tide fans would love to see that. Of course, again, week 1, not trying to put the cart before the horse here. Let's check out some other big games throughout all of college football today. Mike, 2:30 right off the bat. Oregon and Georgia are going to go head-to-head. And later on, of course, the one that I'm looking forward to, Notre Dame and Ohio State. I grew up a Notre Dame fan. I'm not anymore, but it's always going to be interesting. I think it's going to be a competitive game. Just throughout college football, you look at some of those games. It's back. College football is here. It's an exciting time.
Yeah, Utah versus Florida, I think, is another good one. I'm looking forward to watching. Florida they always have talent. You kind of wonder what they're going to be each year. And a lot of people seem to like Billy Napier long term as a coach, and he's always a name that gets floated when people talk about replacing Nick Saban. So how does he perform in a game like this, I think, is always something to file away. And Notre Dame, Ohio State is what college football should be on a weekly basis. And I'm put me in the category of somebody who doesn't want to watch
Bama, Utah State,
right? Or watch the Ohio State versus Ohio State, some directional school. Come on, let's just play the real games.
I agree.
Get through some of this fake
I agree. No question. Well, guys, we are looking forward to kickoff 6:30 at Bryant-Denny Stadium. Alabama kicks off the season against Utah State. Utah State already 1-0 on the year, so Bama has a little bit of tape on them, but don't expect to see a whole lot. Bama obviously not going to show their hand too much in week 1 at home. Mike, appreciate it. Any last comments before we take off?
No, that's it. I'll be going on paternity leave on Monday.
Yay!
So this will be my last game that I cover until LSU, so you won't be seeing my face for a little while, but glad that we could do this show today, and then I'll be back in November.
I love it. Appreciate it, Mike. Enjoy that baby, man. They're only young for so long. You know that. So, all right, guys, thanks so much for tuning in to the Alabama Pregame Show brought to you by Medical Properties Trust. For Mike Rodak, I'm Simone Eli. We will see you for the postgame show after Bama probably beats Utah State at home. Have a good day.
Medical Properties Trust, at the very heart of healthcare.